Bom dia a todos, peço silêncio, só favor, muito obrigado, para se instalar. This panel will be in English, as you know, because it's a co-organization between the Portuguese Atlantic Committee and the Heritage Foundation. My name is João Rebelo. I'm the president of the Portuguese Atlantic Committee. Thank you very much to be here. The coffee break was okay. So I will introduce the panel, and then Professor João Pereira Coutinho will moderate the debate. You are listening? It's okay, the sound is good now? Okay. I have to speak louder then. Thank you very much for that. So thank you very much, Professor João Carlos Espada, for the invitation again for the Portuguese Atlantic Committee to co-organize with the Heritage Foundation this panel. Thank you very much to the moderator, the speakers. We are repeating most of them for the last panel last year. So it's good because, as you remember, we were in the middle of the pandemic. We still are finishing it, but now it's better. But if you recall that debate last year, all the members of the panel discussed a lot of issues that really happened. Some of them, so it will be very nice to see that. We have 3 of our speakers will be by Zoom, but the moderator will invite them to participate. So I have 2 more minutes. First of all, to introduce the team that will be in the debate, the future of NATO. It's not new discussion, the future of NATO. We are debating since the 60s the future of NATO, because it's the most important and vital, that's the approach that I have, military, political military organization for Portugal, and of course for the member of the NATO. I would like also to mention that NATO is in the 72 anniversary, and is still there, still enjoying a large consensus among all the 30 countries that is vital for the security of Europe and the transatlantic link with the United States and Canada. We will talk also with the Charter of the Atlantic from 1941. It's 80 years old, so we are talking about an organization that was built and created after the Second World War in a total different strategic environment, but still is there, it's working, is the most successful military alliance actually, and we, as a country, Portugal is proud to be there on the military alliance. I will give you some numbers. 2 recent surveys, one made by NATO 2 years ago, said that 68% of the Portuguese defend the presence of Portugal in NATO. And this year, sorry, the National Defense Institute of Portugal made the same question. One of the questions of the survey was what was the perception of the Portuguese population about NATO, and 73% said that it was a good perception, and they defend the presence of Portugal at NATO. So Portugal is by far one of the 5 countries that have the highest numbers on the perception of NATO. So it's very important for you to know, we have a lot of students that are here, that NATO is still not only on most of the political parties, but also on the population, an organization that keep a very high standard of appreciation. So it's very important to say that to my friends. As you know, I told last year, and I think we can told again and again the next year, the last strategic concept was in the Lisbon Summit in 2010, and now, 11 years after that, we can say that the world is more dangerous, certainly, more uncertain, and above all, less Occidental and less Atlantic. So the drift for the Pacific and Indo-Pacific is clear for everyone. So NATO struggles also to be in a strategic environment different, of course, from it was created, but also 10 years ago. I will launch some ideas to the discussion. The new strategic concept, it will be in the table, of course. NATO will have a summit in next year, in Madrid, to approve the new strategic concept. As you know, the other strategic concept never thought about that Berlin Wall will fall. then never predict that the global terrorism will happen after 9/11. And this strategic concept right now don't talk one time about China, which means really that the strategic concept of NATO have the tendency not to see the big picture and predict what will happen. It's difficult to predict what will happen, but it gives actually, we have to be very humble when we are discussing prediction about the future, try to create frameworks from NATO after the concept, the new strategic concept, to work on that, but always to know that we cannot predict what will happen. It didn't predict the pandemic, of course. So when the new strategic concept will be presented and voted and approved in the Madrid summit, you can be sure maybe 2 years after that, we will find that is updated already. But that is for our members of the panel to discuss this. Finally, I will finish. I will pass my 5 minutes. I will now pass the floor to Professor João Pereira Coutinho. You know, of course, he's a professor at the Catholic School. He's very well known also, a writer also, a journalist. He works in a lot of spaces. And so the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. João Rebelo, and welcome everyone to this excellent panel. Well, I have to say 2 things first. The first one is that actually I am not Mrs. Reka Schmerkenny, as you may easily see. Unfortunately, Mrs. Schmerkenny cannot be here for personal reasons. And secondly, I'm very proud to be here. I'm very honored. I would like to thank to the Institute for Political Studies, and I would like to say hi to all these brilliant speakers we have here today with us. And I will follow the order in which the names are presented in the program. So I will begin with Gary Schmidt. He will be our first speaker. Dr. Schmidt is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies issues related to the American presidency and topics in national security. He is the author and the editor of many books, and in the area of national security, his most recent book is Hard Look at Hard Power, Assessing the Defense Capabilities of Key US Allies and Security Partners. So, Dr. Schmidt, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers and, for inviting me. It's been a couple of years since I was able to come to Portugal, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I miss being there, but hopefully this will satisfy the audience. So I think I want to begin by sort of talking about if I had to give a title to my talk, it'd be 2 cheers for NATO. You know, we have a saying that 3 cheers is for something we really approve of. So, well, I'm going to start by saying 2 cheers for NATO. That's far more praise, of course, than many would give the alliance. Most famously, Trump called NATO obsolete, and Macron has called it brain dead. Now, I don't think either man is correct in that assessment. In fact, historically, NATO has proved relatively adept at meeting new challenges as the security environment has changed. Nor has US leadership been particularly constrained by alliance partners from what we in the US want to do. In fact, NATO has been relatively responsive to changes in American strategic outlook over the years. And I want to go through a quick list of those changes the US wanted just to make this point. In 1950, for example, Truman wants to rearm Germany. NATO agrees. In the mid-50s, President Eisenhower lays down what he called the New Look strategy with its reliance on nuclear weapons to deter the Soviets. Then you have President Kennedy coming into office and essentially dumping the New Look for a flexible response, requiring renewed emphasis on conventional arms, which NATO agreed to. The next big decision for NATO was how to respond to Moscow's deployment of the highly accurate missiles, the SS-20s, in the late 1970s. the Carter team and NATO agreed to a dual track approach that led the US to deploy its own missiles and cruise missiles in the face of a massive anti-nuclear movement in Europe. And of course, it eventually concluded with an INF treaty negotiated by the Reagan administration. That was followed by the Reagan team's own new air-land battle doctrine that required NATO to adopt a new set of innovations of warfighting. And then, of course, following the end of the Cold War, NATO is told by the US that its new mission will be out of area or out of business. That is, NATO was no longer going to be confined to just defending Allied territory. And so you see NATO going to the Balkans, into Africa and Afghanistan. And at the same time, it moves to eliminate possible geopolitical gray zone by expanding NATO into Central and Eastern Europe. And now, post 2014, NATO has met the challenge of a resurgent Russian threat by creating new operational logistic commands, put forward new initiatives in cyber and hybrid warfare, pushed deployments into the Baltics and Southeast Europe, and has tripled the size of its high readiness joint force to some 40,000 troops. Even on the topic of defense budget, everyone's favorite complaint here in the US about NATO, there's been progress. Across the alliance for 7 straight years, there's been an increase in defense spending. And that includes 2020 and 2021, when we've all been dealing with the pandemic. In fact, of the major powers, if you factor in inflation, only the US defense budget has actually gone down. Since 2014, more than 200 billion has been added to defense budgets by allies other than the US. 10 allies now spend more than 2% of their GDP on defense, that target percentage seen as the minimum. Now, that's not great, but still more than the 3 allies that met that target back in 2014. Perhaps just as significant, 24 allies now spend at least 20% of their defense budget on the procurement of weapons and supplies. A huge jump from just a few years ago when military procurement was being devoured by military personnel costs as folks moved to all volunteer forces. Frankly, it's always bugged me that there wasn't more complaining from NATO and its members when in 2012, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, with the chairman of the Nobel Prize saying that the EU had been key in making the continent of war become a continent of peace. While the EU might have deserved that award, it certainly should have shared it with NATO, since it was the alliance that largely provided the security and in turn, the basic stability on the continent that allowed the subsequent integration and cooperation that the EU has in fact accomplished. Now, since I opened up with just 2 cheers for NATO, I have to explain why not a full-throated 3. Well, to start, we need to go back a decade. At the end of 2011, the Obama Pentagon did an assessment of what the US military could handle in terms of contingency and conflicts. They concluded that the US military could realistically only deal with one major conflict at a time, with perhaps a bit of additional capacity to handle a smaller crisis, but then only that for a few months. The result of this analysis was something called the Defense Policy Guidance that was published in early 2012 that said American defenses would now concentrate on the Asia-Pacific theater, the so-called pivot, and was justified in part on the basis that there was no longer a threat in Europe that had to be met. The western end of the Eurasian landmass was largely at peace. Well, a lot has changed since then. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Putin has been even more aggressive about challenging the post-Cold War order. And the Russian military has regained its footing from the low points of the 2008 conflict with Georgia. And of course, the PRC, China, has done nothing but grow in military strength and hubris, while Iran and North Korea have not receded into the dustbin of history. The American military has responded to the change in the security environment by trying to increase its capabilities to deal with the great power competitors and has made considerable progress on that front. However, the American defense budget, when you adjust for inflation, is actually somewhat smaller than it was in 2011, when the defense policy guidance was issued. And more importantly, the size of the American military, its men, ships, planes, is really no larger than it was then. In short, the US military is more capable in certain respects, but not to the degree that the improvement in the quality of the force can make up for its lack of quantity. As others have pointed out, even the most capable naval vessel can only be in one sea at a time. In short, we have essentially the same force and the same level of resources in 2011, 2012, but a much tougher security environment. Now, it's obvious Washington's security focus will be on China and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Indeed, there are any number of folks inside and outside the US government predicting a possible conflict with China in a few years' time, as Beijing tries to head off the combined efforts of the US, Japan, and Australia to create a no doubt dominant deterrent posture a few years down the road. But the Russian problem remains. While not as problematic as China, perhaps, it still remains significant. And if deterrence is to be maintained, European allies and NATO partners, such as Sweden, will need to do more than they are now. Now, let me offer a few concrete agenda items, which by no means is meant to be exhaustive. I guess the most important up front is major allies simply need to spend more. It's as simple as that. If, for example, the UK truly wants to be a global Britain, it can't be that without a larger army, a larger air force, and more capabilities at sea. Second, a few years back, the alliance set out a goal by 2020 to be able to deploy up to 30 maneuver battalions, 30 kinetic air squadrons, and 30 combat vessels in a theater of operations within 30 days. Well, it's been crickets since that pledge. And if I had to guess, I would say that the Allies were expecting a good chunk of that new capability to come from the United States. But as we say in America, we've already given at the office. No new divisions will be showing up in Europe. No new carrier groups will be in the Mediterranean or in the North Sea. There might be small increments, but there will not be wholesale force changes from what we've added since 2014. Three, even if NATO had more fighting capability on paper, it remains short on those things that bring that capability into fruition and sustain it. Such items as air transport, electronic warfare, air defenses, ammunition stocks, and even the roads and bridges that you need to move and handle a large number of forces moving from Central Europe to the Eastern Front are still lacking. In short, if you can't get there, it doesn't matter how ready you are to fight. Finally, NATO needs to agree on, and as mentioned, and publish its new strategic concept. It's been more than a decade since the last one, and of course, the strategic environment has undergone considerable change. Members have avoided going through this painful process of producing a new document because of all the fights and disagreements that inevitably occur. But it's also the case that resolving those disputes clears the way for moving forward for an alliance that works generally through consensus. If you know what your goals are, it's considerably easier to resolve disputes about operations, budgets, and tactics. And frankly, without a new NATO strategic concept, it's harder to rebut Macron's statement that NATO is brain dead, or the notion that European strategic autonomy isn't a waste of everyone's time and money. You can't defeat something with nothing, even ideas. Now, all that said, let me conclude by saying that for all its flaws, past and present, NATO is a uniquely successful institution. Indeed, if one were to pull back the curtain on discussions about what the US and its allies in Asia want to accomplish in the future, one would see the shadow of NATO's model in the background. So while NATO might not deserve 3 chairs, I think it merits more than many would give it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your very sharp and important observations on the present and future of NATO. Our next speaker will be Dr. Jeffrey Gedman. Dr. Gedman is co-founder with Francis Fukuyama of American Purpose, a non-partisan international ideas and policy forum dedicated to the defense of liberal democracy. Actually, I advise you to take a look at the American Purpose. That is one of the most challenging publications online that you can find today in the United States of America. Dr. Gedman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to add my voice to Gary Schmidt and thank Professor Espada and your colleagues and the partner organizations for a fabulous conference. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but happy to be with you via Zoom today. To the question at hand, it seems to me that there are really many lenses. Is it 10, 20, 30 or more through which one can look at the question and problem of NATO, current state and future? Gary just offered a lens that looked at military defense and hard security capabilities and realities. Let me try something a little bit different and a little bit more political, and I hope it will open up the conversation a little bit. And I'm very eager to hear from the other panelists. First, it seems to me then, now, and arguably forever, this is about mission and about purpose and about why. And from that, so many things flow. And as it was the case with the first Secretary General of NATO, the dictum was NATO is there to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. But today, lots has changed and plenty is in need of amendment. But one might say today that the purpose of NATO is still, in some fashion, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out. And I would say now, the Germans around to help us collectively contain and confront China as a central challenge in the next 10 years and beyond. That is to say, in my view, after Brexit, and in the context of what I see in the United States, a growing national mood of retrenchment on both sides of the aisle, I think a defining, or let's say a central political question becomes what to expect from the shape of a post-Merkel Germany. So love her or hate her, Angela Merkel was there for a decade and a half and was fundamentally pro-NATO, pro-American, pro-European, pro-Western, and stable, somewhat predictable, served as a sort of anchor in leadership in Germany. And now I think real change is likely to be afoot. Now, when I say this to you, I'm not talking specifically and granularly about the formation of a new German government now, since the elections at the end of September. I'm not talking about what will happen or could happen in the next year or two. I expect that to be stable, if one can talk about stability in times like these. One excludes nothing, but I don't expect any great surprises from today's vantage point. However, I think there are deeper, and if I may put it this way, structural issues that have to be considered. And in that frame, let me offer you 3 questions to watch, to explore, to investigate. Question number 1 is, in Germany, can the mainstream, the establishment parties, and I'm thinking about the Christian Democrats or the CDU/CSU and the Social Democrats, remake themselves, reconnect to voters, and keep extremist elements and small destabilizing parties at bay? If you want a snapshot, then you can look at the recent elections and say, we're pretty good or we're fine. But if you look what came before and look at larger and deeper trends, I'm not sure that this movie, if I may put it that way, this film, this novel is over and these questions are settled. I think, as is the case in many of our democracies, the United States too, the mainstream parties and elites, if I may put it that way, have things to answer for, and adaptation is still in order and part of the game going forward. Number two, on Europe, question, can Berlin ease up? And I am painting in broad brush, but can Berlin ease up on its vision of and about federalism and supranationalism to help keep the current EU together? We did have Brexit. I wouldn't exclude that a doubling down on European integration, and one hears about this actually in Berlin in some circles. Hooray, the Brits are gone. We can now double down on European integration. If that were in the cards, I don't think in the next years the current EU will cohere or hang together. And then again, externally, if you will, rather than coherence, a kind of fragmentation becomes the order of the day. The third question I pose is, will this Germany over these next years stay fundamentally oriented toward the West, the United States, anchored in NATO, or will it come to see itself as a kind of referee between the Americans and Russians and between the Americans and the Chinese? It was said in the last government by the economics minister, it was said in the last government by the chancellor herself, we don't want to be a football between Washington and Beijing. Well, Berlin shouldn't be and can't be if we're to be successful to confront and contain China. If those are three questions off the top of my head that would help us understand what could evolve and develop in this next Germany, if I may put it that way, then let me offer you three framing points for consideration about, and this is from the lens of the United States and me as an American speaking to you today, about the US-German bilateral relationship. And those 3 points, framing points, points for consideration are these. 3 decades ago, with unification and the restoration of German sovereignty, something happened virtually overnight, and we didn't come to terms with it. Not sure if we've still fully come to terms with it. Germany, West Germany, ceased to be the junior partner of the United States, and the Germans began a kind of renegotiation, however unstated and informal, with the United States about terms and equities and expectations. Consider that. Then consider as a second point, a framing point, that following the 1990s, when, well, we had growth and we won wars in the Gulf and we won wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, following the 1990s, patterns changed. And as Russian revanchism was growing, I think in the eyes of many German elites, America was beginning to shrink. Actually, I'll come back to this in a moment, but Bush 43 was widely seen as guilty of overreach. Eloquent Obama was seen widely as the opposite. Trump was Germany's nightmare, and now President Biden, early days, is seen as a disappointment. This was the fellow who would bring consultation and competence, and early marks are not high, they're mixed or they're low. And then finally, as I head to a conclusion for you here, there is in Germany an increased awareness this last 1 and 2 and 3 years and so that China poses a threat. But I would say to you, words like threat And words like enemy are still not part of the modern German vocabulary. In fact, today, in ideas and language that describe and reflect ideas, it's still the legacy and the idea of Ostpolitik and Wandel durch Handel, changing countries through trade, and of course also rapprochement, that actually carry the day in many, if not most, foreign policy circles. There are exceptions. Skepticism about American leadership is growing. I would say there are few exceptions. And do take a look at Bill Galston's column this week in the Wall Street Journal. Transatlantic relationships, the transatlantic relationships in trouble if our friends are unwilling to confront China. Look to Germany first, I would say. So just as Dr. Schmidt, as friend Gary Schmidt did, let me part then or conclude then with some thoughts, because to describe a problem is not to suggest or indicate what to do about it. Here in bullet form are 4 thoughts about how to listen and learn and manage this relationship and this evolving post-Merkel Germany. Number 1, to keep Americans engaged in acting responsibly. Well, I never said that this would be easy. 2, to keep associations strong among Atlantic-minded nations. And that's why this annual conference in Portugal is so vitally important. 3, to maintain strong and deepening ties between the United States and France, which may sound odd to the ears of some Americans. And then finally, to support a new generation of Atlanticists in Germany, culture, nurture, motivate, anything we can do in that area. I'll complete with this final thought. And this applies to other European capitals too, self-evidently. But imagine you sit in Berlin and you are 38 or 40 or 42 years old, and you are in the foreign ministry, or you're in an editorial role, or you're in a foundation or a think tank, or by the way, part of German industry. The America you know is not the America who helped contribute and helped to win the Cold War or to consolidate the peace in the 1990s, but rather, fair or unfair, the America you know fits to the narrative of the last 20 years. And that song goes like this: Iraq, Afghanistan, eloquent but feckless, and maybe even, forgive me, feeble Obama, Donald J. Trump, good heavens, good God, and Joe Biden, we hold our breath. So nothing happens overnight. It's a film, not a snapshot from a camera, but these are patterns that I see, questions and concerns I have. And then back to my original point, in the politics of NATO, a number of things are very important, but I would put at the center of our consideration how Germany evolves in the next 2 and 5 and 7 and 10 years. So thank you all for listening, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Gedman, for your observations on the challenges we face and the role the United States has to play in facing those challenges. Our next speaker is, well, a good old friend of the Institute, John O'Sullivan, journalist, author, lecturer, broadcaster. He's the president of the Danube Institute in the beautiful city of Budapest. Well, I envy you, John, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, fellow students, it's obviously once more a great pleasure to be present at the Political Forum in Estoril. This is the Cheltenham Gold Cup of conferences, and it's a great pleasure also to be able to congratulate Professor Espada on another successful program devoted to a highly topical and even existential topic. I say once more with some feeling because I was present at, I think, the second or third forum when many of you in the audience were not yet born, and many of the organizers and speakers at these events who now have titles like professor were graduate students at best. Now we have to call them Sir, Doctor, and in some cases, by the way, Your Excellency. But we're all of us on both sides of the lectern much better educated in politics, international relations, democracy, and political morality as a result of being Professor Espada's students over the years. This year, however, has given us a much more gritty and substantial menu on all panels to think about, but on this panel in particular. Last year, several of us on the panel were on a very similar panel, I think NATO and authoritarianism, and I suspect my other panelists have had to reprise some of the themes we discussed last year. Yet something is very, very different. What we discussed last year as possibilities and emerging problems have now emerged, maybe not fully, and are in the process of reshaping a new global strategic status quo. I mean, here is something I said a year ago. We are increasingly aware of the Chinese challenge to NATO countries in the twin forms of technical and commercial subversion. Our post-Cold War view of China was that our welcoming them into commercial and Pacific relationships of trade, investment, and cultural contacts would gradually transform into good neighbors and strategic partners. That hasn't happened. China at home, I said then, has moved towards not authoritarianism, but totalitarianism in its domestic policy. It's herding the eager Muslims into a new gulag and building a communications panopticon to control its own people. These are classic totalitarian measures. And it's moved towards an aggressive expansionism in its foreign policy, seeking to seize islands in its immediate neighborhood, an expansionism that doesn't threaten NATO as such, because those islands are out of area, but its use of economic contacts around the world subversively does weaken NATO, I think was intended to, and some NATO member states, notably the United States, have interests and allies outside the NATO area that are also threatened. Well, what were vague possibility of threats a year ago are now very clearly much more. Much of what I say today reflects a strategic outlook that was, in a sense, drawn in a big picture way by Professor Galston, and I think it's also true that I think we all have to take into account the lesson just taught us by Gary Schmidt that defense requires defense expenditure. Within those broad truths, however, I want to concentrate on three topics: China, Europe, and China, the US alliance structure, and Europe. And I want to make the point of entry into this the AUKUS agreement that startled the world when it was announced only 3 weeks ago. On paper, AUKUS is mainly an agreement between the three traditional allies to share information, intelligence, and technology in a joint program to build and operate advanced nuclear-powered submarines. Nuclear-powered, but in Australia's case, not nuclear-armed because of its signature on a non-proliferation agreement. The origin of AUKUS was a drive by the Australians to strengthen their alliance with the US in response to the growing threat, including a naval threat from China, made more threatening by Beijing's attempt to dictate Australian domestic policies through trade sanctions. The Brits joined in, wanting to strengthen their global role with old allies following Brexit, and Britain had the resources, the technology, military interoperability with the other partners, and above all, trust between the allies to be a welcome partner, and the US was looking for ways of countering an increasingly bellicose China in what President Biden firmly denies is a new Cold War. Well, let me just briefly talk about the concept of a new Cold War with China. I don't think anybody in the West, as the policies of the last 30 years have shown, intends or wants a Cold War with China. If there is going to be a Cold War with China, it will be because the Chinese have, in effect, decided they want to have one, or the current leadership does. We must obviously respond to that if it becomes an even bigger reality than it currently seems to be, and it cannot be reasonably argued that a decision to defend oneself against threats of a serious kind amount themselves to aggression. That is the rhetorical trick which Soviet propaganda used for about 40 years in Europe, that the argument being defense equals aggression. That's something which we cannot accept, and it is not reasonable for our reactions to be shaped by that thought. But once AUKUS was announced, everyone saw it had a deeper significance than technology transfer. Its announcement was treated by Beijing as the first shot in a Cold War, although the first casualty to fall was actually France, which suffered its own 90 billion non-nuclear submarine, which lost its own deal with the Australians worth $90 billion, and I'll come back to that. As the hostile reactions of both China and, on this occasion, France, suggest, AUKUS is likely to be the start of a major reordering of alliances in Europe, Asia, and Pacific, and in particular, the Indo-Pacific region, and as such, the forerunner of a global geopolitical shift. It's the most significant result so far of Washington's tilt to Asia that began under President Obama, continued under President Trump, and today, under President Biden, has moderated America's focus on Europe and its reliance on NATO as its main partner in collective defense arrangements. I don't think that was a plan, so to speak, but that's the way it's beginning to look it's going. America, the US, has chosen to respond to a new challenge from China with a smaller, less rule-bound, and more effective military pact, resting in part on civilizational sympathies with older allies. Yes, to some extent, it is at present the Anglosphere in arms, so to speak. But it will be more than that, and wider than that. However, for the moment, the result is the US has created another defense pact to keep China's growing influence in check and to protect its allies. The two questions arise. Who are the winners and losers? And how can the AUKUS partners maximize the number of winners and minimize the losers in the course of strengthening AUKUS as a force to deter and contain China, supporting its neighbors, and establishing a stable peace in the long term, which a non-hegemonic Beijing might eventually join. I should remember, we should remember, modestly here, of course, that we haven't pulled off exactly the same trick with Russia as yet. We haven't yet persuaded the Russians to give up their hegemonic ambitions and join their partners in an alliance. Now, who's the loser? Well, I would argue China is the big loser in relation to this new alliance, because it's almost entirely the result of Beijing's own aggressive and expansionist policies, including some of the things I mentioned before. But let me single out in particular what Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, told Walter Russell Mead in a Wall Street Journal interview. He told him that Beijing had demanded that Canberra, Australia, should... oh dear, sorry. My apologies. Sorry. Morrison said the Chinese had demanded that they remedy 14 Chinese grievances. They should stop funding anti-China research, refrain from provocative actions like requesting a more thorough World Health Organization investigation of the origins of COVID, stop opposing strategic Chinese investments in Australia, and block private media outlets from publishing unfriendly news about China. Now, those demands are the kind of conditions that a victorious power in war thinks it is able to impose on a defeated power. And of course, it didn't produce the result that presumably Beijing wanted. In fact, Morrison immediately responded by trying to create AUKUS to enable Canberra to reject such demands, but also as a general deterrence to Chinese adventurism. I think it's also fair to say that the new alliance will embolden resistance to that adventurism from those of China's neighbors, which will never think perhaps of joining it, but will nonetheless be grateful it's there. So, in short, Xi Jinping has constructed a powerful combination of powers against his own country. Now, that situation is better than the looming Chinese hegemony preceding it, but since China suffers from a growing list of internal problems, slowing growth, rising unemployment, a massive overinvestment in property, middle-class fears that their own fortunes are now at risk from the revival of Maoism, that the condition of China has its own risks. China watchers, from historian Neil Ferguson to former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, warn seriously that a communist regime, fearing its own declining authority, might be tempted to recover popular support by a military adventure abroad that may misfire. So the caution there is, here be a sick dragon, beware of trying to stroke it. Beijing has made clear, of course, that it will try to block AUKUS. And it's true that such a resistance could include a high-risk attempt to resolve the Taiwan problem. But I personally think that it's unlikely because the Chinese leadership has generally been very cautious. But the problem in general for Beijing is that the more aggressively it talks as well as behaves, the more it will encourage third parties to join or cooperate with AUKUS. And AUKUS rests on strong foundations, and that's when I come to the US alliance structure. Foundations that are strong, that were laid on earlier cooperation between the US and the UK. The special relationship, much mocked, differed from NATO in being a worldwide alliance rather than a purely European one in military and diplomatic and intelligence affairs throughout the whole of the Cold War. It expanded early on. Oh dear, I'm sorry. I've gone on too long. I think I've got to cut through to the problem for the French and for the EU. Right. I'll just say that this alliance effectively means that America is constructing a network of alliances in the Far East, which it can call on in distress, or indeed without distress. For the Europeans, and the French in particular, AUKUS is a real problem. Now, I don't have the time to say exactly the choices that are open to the Europeans. But I will say that there is a choice which is not much talked about and which I think offers the best hope. And that is sticking in NATO, led by the US, swallowing their pride after the rebuff on this occasion, and seeking a partnership of sorts with AUKUS. I don't think Germany will be attracted by that because it's drifting with a kind of commerce-first foreign policy towards a closer relationship with China and with Russia. But for the French, and this is a key point, and the French, first of all, have been treated badly. That's true. Whether there were reasons for it doesn't matter. They've been treated badly. Therefore, it seems to me, when we look at France's interests in the Indo-Pacific region, they have real interests. They have, I can give you the figures quickly, I think, 1.5 million citizens. They have territory, islands. They have 8,000 military in the South Pacific. They deserve the sympathy of their allies. And whatever the relations in Europe between France and its neighbors are, we would be well advised to offer the EU, and thus France, the possibility of forming some kind of partnership through NATO. The French are the only people in NATO who are able to derive serious benefit from joining with AUKUS. And if a deal were done whereby we offered the French and they accepted membership of AUKUS, the EU would then have a member state that remained a serious global player. The French, it would mean the abandonment of a long-term Europeanist global strategy. By the way, the French didn't sign the Atlantic Charter until after the war was over. But they've always been Europe firsters. So, but this would enable them to retain their status as a global power by joining with these other allies in that part of the world. I will add, so I think it behoves NATO, France's NATO partners to go to them, the Americans particularly, and the Brits, and offer them a part of the prospect. I will add finally, there is another EU member state that has citizens, interests, territory, and cultural links with the Indo-Pacific world, and that until recently had a rather powerful navy with special naval skills. That European member state is, of course, Portugal, but I leave it to a member of the audience to make the case for Portugal's membership of AUKUS.
Well, thank you, John, for your observations. Our next speaker will be Professor Olivia Franco, professor and researcher. The students are already missing you, Olivia, so here you have. Olivia is professor and researcher at the Institute for Political Studies, and currently she's teaching at Georgetown University as FLAD visiting professor. Olivia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, João, and hi to everyone. Good morning from DC. It's great to join everybody again for the Estoril Political Forum. Thanks for the invitation. And I must say that if there's one positive legacy of the pandemic, it is this, being able to meet virtually across nations and continents to talk and discuss different points of view, and that's really, really great. So my comments today will be quite brief. I will start by asserting on what all the panels in this conference have been saying, that the past 2 years confirmed the most important structural feature of the world today is not globalization based on cooperative multilateralism anymore, but it is rather unruly global competition between increasingly assertive authoritarian powers and weakened liberal democracies. And unfortunately, these are not good news, and the general picture is quite bleak. Freedom House's 2021 report is very clear on that. And I will quote page number 1 of the report. As lethal pandemic, economic and physical insecurity, and violent conflict ravaged the world in 2020, democracy's defenders sustained heavy new losses in their struggle against authoritarian foes, shifting the international balance in favor of tyranny, quote unquote. And then the report continues by saying, quote, last year, nearly 75% of the world's population lived in a country that faced deterioration. The ongoing decline has given rise to claims of democracy's inherent inferiority. Proponents of this idea include official Chinese and Russian commentators seeking to strengthen their international influence while escaping accountability for abuses, as well as anti-democratic actors within democratic states who see an opportunity to consolidate power. They are both shearing the breakdown of democracy and exacerbating it, pitting themselves against the brave groups and individuals who have set out to reverse the damage, unquote. Indeed, a very, very harsh picture. And in this challenging context, where democracy is evidently under assault, what can NATO do? And more generally, what has a military alliance got to do with democracy? Well, first, NATO is the most powerful regional alliance in the world, at least so far, and consequently, it is an alliance that finds itself in and must relate to this context. And second, because in the past 7 decades, Americans and Europeans together have been accustomed through cooperative institutions like NATO to setting international rules based on the primacy of law and liberty, constituting what has been coined the international liberal order. Not by accident, the Atlantic Charter, whose 80th anniversary we're celebrating at this conference, was the key inspiration for the text of the North Atlantic Treaty that created NATO and was signed in 1949. In its preamble, the treaty states, and again I'm quoting, "The parties to this treaty reaffirm their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments. They are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law," unquote. This means that from its inception, NATO has been more than just a military alliance. It has embraced a political role built on a shared democratic identity. In reality, NATO has also been a community of values. Consequently, a lack of response from the transatlantic alliance on the current competition between authoritarianism and liberal democracy would ultimately undermine its reputation and credibility. Should NATO then transform itself into a global alliance for democracy promotion? I don't think so. Rather, what I'll be advocating is that, first, the North Atlantic Alliance must remain a regional defensive alliance, and also that there's place in the world for other regional defensive alliances based on the same principles and values that NATO. Second, that NATO should not be associated directly with democracy promotion. Afghanistan was not a very good experience, as we all know now. But instead, NATO must necessarily be associated with democratic resilience. In other words, I'm of the opinion that to prevail in the present challenging global competition, the US and its European allies need to unflinchingly show to the rest of the world that their system of governance can outperform China's and Russia's authoritarianism, and that they can thwart Chinese and Russian non-democratic attempts to reshape the international order to their own benefit. Of course, in itself, this is an already formidable task, not least because, as new data released this month by the Rule of Law Index 2021 shows us, while Europe and North America continue to outperform every other region in the world in democratic governments, there are several signs that should ring alarm bells. According to this index, 14 of 20 countries in the European Union decline in their rule of law scores, with 8 of those decliners, Austria, France, Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, and Romania, dropping for the second year in a row. Additionally, the report tells us that in the domain of civil society, which includes, for example, measures of civic participation, freedom of expression, and freedom of association, 22 countries in the broader Europe and North American region declined in all three dimensions, being the United States one of those countries. So, just as NATO faces a deteriorating external security environment, it is also confronting internal turbulence related with democratic principles being unequally upheld across the alliance. Of course, the erosion of democratic norms or of rule of law in member states has already marked other historical periods in the alliance. Remember the late 60s or early 70s, when NATO faced a test of its values and it debated how to deal with growing authoritarianism or revolutionary instability in member countries like Portugal, Greece, or Turkey. And yet, it is very important not to forget that in a rapidly negative changing environment, such as the one we are currently experiencing, a deficit in internal cohesion and in shared values can rapidly become also an external security threat. Indeed, an inattention to the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law may create societal vulnerabilities that authoritarian competitors can quickly exploit to destabilize individual allies or NATO as a whole. The examples are numerous, and I'm just referring to a few of them, from propaganda to disinformation campaigns, from financial and political support of illiberal parties to special bilateral relations based in face mask diplomacies. The fact is that the usual authoritarian suspects do not hesitate to use every opportunity they can find to divide transatlantic allies and weaken the alliance's unity. And so obviously next question can only be, what must NATO do to counter democratic backsliding within its ranks? In contrast to the European Union, which is arguably better equipped, I don't know, but arguably better equipped to address democratic regressing through its rule of law mechanism, at least it has a rule of law mechanism, NATO has no legal provisions for suspending or expelling any ally who violates the alliance's founding principles. Also, the fact that NATO operates by consensus means that any punitive action against the offending ally risks incurring retaliatory action on other NATO business. So following other analysts, what I'm trying to tell here is that it is time to create within NATO a new governance committee that addresses issues of democratic backsliding in the alliance. Not necessarily or primarily to suspend, expel, or penalize a member country, but I think it's very important to address collectively political and governance matters that constitute direct threats to the alliance's core principles. It is true that Article 5 is the heart of the transatlantic alliance, but it should also be recalled that there are several governance requirements that member states need to meet in order for the defensive alliance to work properly. We all know liberal democratic governments have historically been better at establishing civilian control of the military and intelligence services, of ensuring legislative monitoring of different branches of power, of guaranteeing transparency of arms procurements, of creating confidence building measures, etc., etc. These are all democratic foundations that make NATO stronger. To sum up, what I want to underline is that there's a strong, very strong link between democratic governance and security gains. NATO's strength and resilience have long derived from the Allies' shared commitments to the liberal democratic values and spirit of the North Atlantic Treaty. But today, in the face of the global weakening of democratic principles and values, I think it is time for NATO to face up this erosion, including among its members, and to assume that this is one of the great security challenges of our time. And that's exactly why it should appear reflected as such in the Alliance's next strategic concept to be approved early next summer in Madrid. I'm ending, but not without first leaving a note of optimism for our students, who, of course, will be our leaders in the future. Yes, democracy today is beleaguered, but it is not defeated. It's an enduring popularity in more hostile parts of the world, and its perseverance after a devastating 2 years of pandemic and continued curtailment of our freedoms are signals of resilience that bode well for the future of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for your inspiring words, actually. And our last speaker will be Professor Miguel Mongerdino. He's a professor at the Institute and a very known public intellectual in Portugal. So I think Miguel will have 10 minutes to solve all the challenges of the international liberal order, although I think he can do it in 5. So, Miguel.
Thank you. I certainly will not need 10 minutes, that's for sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure to be back after 2 years in this wonderful place. I feel like, you know, the last hoplite on the front line, on the right, which is almost surely the most deadly position to be in a battle, especially before lunch. And I'm very aware of that. I'm reminded of a one-page memo by Winston Churchill, and the title is On Brevity. And I intend to follow the memo in the next few minutes. Many years ago, when I was in infantry, the first lesson that I learned from my captain with the red beret is pay attention to the human terrain. And when I look around this wonderful room, I see very experienced people who have been doing this for decades, and I see 18-year-old students. So I will beg forgiveness to my generation and the older generation. I will speak to the young generation in the next few minutes. Let me propose a framework to discuss these issues. When we are facing strategic times and we have to make informed decisions, there's a wonderful framework. It involves 4 questions. The first question is, what are we talking about? The second question is, where? The third question is, who? And the final question is, when? Let me start with the when. The when question is very important because, as everyone in the panel noticed, and I'm sure you have, we are living in interesting times. And what you see is that preferences about international order that have been dominated by the United States and its European allies for the last decades, that period is over. We are entering a period where there is a contest about the international order and what that means. So the implication is that, at least for me, strategic history never went away. I mean, the idea that we now face a period of competition, for me, is nonsense. There's always been competition. Sometimes it's less visible. Now it is much more visible. And throughout history, other powers always have agency. Now, again, it is much more visible. So The problem we have today and the difficulty we face today is how do we make informed strategic decisions when for the last decades we in Europe kind of pretended that this problem didn't exist, so we shouldn't consider certain issues. Like an out-of-shape athlete, we are out of practice, and we will have to relearn this process. Let me propose a concept. International politics has always been volatile. What we are facing is a different concept, and I propose the concept of turbulence. Turbulence is structural volatility, and the problem with turbulence, the concept of turbulence, is it's a highly dynamic process, and it's non-linear. And we in Portugal tend to think about international politics in a very static way. We are not used to consider non-linear events. And strategy making, by definition, is non-linear. And that's why it's so difficult, or so hard sometimes. Now, strategy making is a very pragmatic art. So let me be pragmatic in my last 3 minutes about the next year NATO strategic concept. 3 things to consider: autonomy, force, and technology and industrial base. The question about autonomy is, are we talking about autonomy within NATO, or are we talking about autonomy away from NATO? This is the first order of business, and unless we can answer that question, it's pointless to go on, because if we can't answer this question, we don't know what we're talking about, because the implications are huge. So the first order of business for us to consider, again, are we talking about autonomy within NATO, or are we talking about autonomy away from NATO? And in Europe, you have very different views about this, and we will have to go through this. The second thing, and we tend to think about NATO in highly political terms, and I have nothing against that, it's really important, but we have to go down to the nitty-gritty of business of what we're talking about. When we talk about force structure, what kind of force structure are we talking about? For example, President Macron's initial entry force in the concept of autonomy away from NATO is a 5,000 strong entry force. For anyone working in military operations, that's not enough. That's not enough. If we're talking about autonomy within NATO, I also believe it's not enough. So there are major force considerations and strategic assets that we have to consider when we go down to the nitty-gritty business of force structure, and we need to think about this. The last thing before I shut up is the technology and industrial base. We have to bring technology and industry to Portuguese strategic debates, because as John rightly said, you cannot understand what's going on in the world if you don't pay attention to technology and the need that the most powerful countries feel to protect their scientific, technological, and industrial base. So this for the younger generations. This is a whole new world. International relations, in a way, has to bring in, and is bringing in, technology and industry, and we need to be much more aware of this field and what it means for us. So this, to conclude my last 30 seconds, if this process is going to happen in Europe and in Portugal, it's going to be long. And we have to start today. On my part, I will. And I look forward to the conversation and for lunch. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Miguel, for your presentation and for your brevity, actually. As I told you, 5 minutes would be more than enough, but please do not try this at home. Now, unfortunately, it will not be possible to have a final round of questions. This panel started a little bit late, but I still have a very important announcement to make. But before I do that, I would like to thank all the speakers of this panel, the speakers that are here in Estoril, those who are there in the United States. And of course, I would like to thank also our host, Dr. João Rebelo. And the announcement is this: the group photo. So the group photo will be at 6:15 p.m. in the stairs by the garden. So we would kindly ask you all to join the stairs from 6:10 p.m. in order to take this photo at 6:15 p.m. So thank you, have a very nice lunch, and see you in the afternoon. Bye-bye, thank you.